Hey, everybody. Welcome to a new podcast. Welcome to a new podcast with me and my very good friend. I might even call him my best friend. I don't know. Tom, he's here and he is actually my neighbor. And I've tried to get rid of him for years, but he just keeps bouncing back. Probably
Yeah.
because we share a love for Star Trek, for living logical, living spatial, and what we're going to do on this podcast is we're going to talk about why we love Star Trek and what it means to us. And we're going to try to go in depth into a bunch of different episodes, a bunch of different shows, and all the ways that it's just meant things to us over the years. And so, Tom, can you start things off and tell us, like, what is like a very early memory? What is the first thing you remember about Star Trek when you were a little kid? Can you start us off?
I was going to say with your introduction to me, I'm like you. I keep on popping up no matter
Nah,
where you go. And even no matter how far you travel, even.
I went
And
to another continent, man, and you
yeah,
came.
and before you knew it, I popped up there too, and you couldn't get rid of me.
You're
And
like a
I'm
bad. What is
also,
the expression? Like a bad penny, a bad quarter, a bad something
yeah,
like that, right?
except for in this case, I'm a Q. And it's also a very appropriate metaphor for the fact that I'm also far superior to you in many ways that you are capable of comprehending.
All right, I'll
So
take that. I'll take that comparison because that makes me Picard. So
you have even got the hairline started to go there.
it's going. Yeah, I'll be there by the time that I'm 50. I will look exactly like Picard.
Yeah, you're gonna. It's very distinguished, man. But my earliest memory of Star Trek. Well, it's. I don't know if this is. What I really remember is it's funny because I grew up in Montana in small towns. Out in, growing up in the 80s and 90s, it's not like this anymore. But back then, when they didn't really have the internet or the nascent internet, it kind of was still. I'm not gonna say the Wild West, but still kind of backwoods country. So like, I remember, when Costco first showed up in Billings, we had to drive an hour and a half to do like any major shopping. And my parents bought, I think what that introduced me to it is they had a set of the first five movies.
On
And
VHS. Yeah,
yeah, on VHS. And my
nice.
parents are,
Was it that set that like made the original Enterprise?
oh
It was
yeah.
like a
Well,
if
the
you put
Enterprise
all
was
the
a movie.
videos next to each other, it was the
Yeah,
original
yeah.
Enterprise.
Yeah,
Nice.
yeah. My
Very
parents still
cool.
have it today. I've thought about stealing it from them. I already stole the original Star Wars trilogy. I've got it sitting here in my office actually. The pre before George Lucas went back and
Yeah, yeah.
screwed it
I
all.
have it over here. Remember at the Bainbridge house, I had the Star Trek movies. I picked them all up at like Goodwill at different times for like 25 cents each.
That's right.
Yeah.
I forgot about it.
I
I
think
found.
that they're in my parents' basement now, so I think I still have them. I just have to bring them down to Brazil from Portland.
I don't have them in this room anymore, but the last one I was at my parents' house. My mom is doing like a super clean out of their house, and I had to like decide what I wanted to keep or not. And I found some old like 1970s Star Trek novels that I had picked up.
Oh man,
I think a couple of them I actually got at garage sales.
cool.
Um, and I went back and I read one of them. It wasn't too bad. It was like an original series episode. But there's another one that the premise is so bad that I don't think I'm even gonna read it. Anyways, but it's very kind of nostalgic. And then I had an idea of doing, something with Star Trek for a while, and I wanted to do some more research on kind of behind the scenes of the original series, and I found this on the internet from
Oh
a post
man, what
narrow.
is that? Hold it closer. I can't quite see. The making of Star Trek. Oh, cool.
Yeah,
Interesting.
and it was actually written. I think it was originally written. The show was still on the air, and then he added stuff later. Yeah, 1968 was the first edition. Um, But yeah, I mean, that's what I think. That was where I think it was introduced because my parents, like their way of winding down and their form of entertainment was movies, and we didn't really have money to go to the movie theaters a lot, and I don't know, my parents didn't really like to go out that much, so they just collected VHS videos, and to this day they have an entire wall of the entertainment room from like top from floor to ceiling
Yeah.
with VHSs. You know, nowadays we have like satellite and TiVo and Netflix and stuff like that. Because the transition wasn't really that fast between I mean, it wasn't really that long between VHS and streaming. So the DVD collection never got that big. But now they don't really collect them physically. But at the time, didn't have that stuff. So, and my parents still have that wall. It's almost like a museum of VHS.
I bet, man. Is That's cool. That's cool. For me, like my dad, it's actually kind of weird because my parents are they're kind of on the line between being very fundamentalist Christian and just being very Christian. Like some of the things that they do are weird, and other things that they do are just like they want to go to church and hang out with their friends. They're right on that line between being strange. Uh, but something weird about my dad is that he loves Star Trek, and it just never really made sense. When I was a kid, even when I was really little, like 6, I was I understood then that it was weird.
Yeah.
That like one of the first shows, one of the things that I loved to do with my dad was watch Star Trek every week, and he grew up with the original series, and I never got into TOS when I was young, but we watched the Next Generation, and something I really remember is like even when I was really in trouble, when I would do something bad, and my mom would say, "No TV, Ryan, no TV for a week," I could still watch Star Trek because my dad wanted to watch Star Trek, and so he put on Star Trek, and my mom would be like, "Ah, but Ryan's not supposed to watch TV," and my dad would be like, "Ah, well, I'm gonna watch Star Trek, so whatever." So I could watch Star Trek even when I was supposedly grounded. And one really cool memory I have of my dad is in the encounter at Farpoint, and another time in the first season, the Enterprise like separates, right? They have that saucer separation, and my dad actually like got all artistic, and he made this Enterprise out of construction paper, and the he made the saucer and the warp drive part that separated, made of paper for me when I was like 6.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, it's really cool.
It's funny with my parents because growing up, it's funny when I look back. 'Cause my parents, they've changed a lot over time, even when I was a kid. Because like my dad went from this kind of atheist to super religious, and there was a period in my childhood when they were very conservative and religious, and then it kind of changed over time, and now my mom's basically like a full-on socialist, and my dad goes back and forth between like Fox News talking points and communism. It almost seems like, you know. But I think the thing about Star Trek that's interesting, it definitely has, especially the older series, has a very defined kind of secular humanist uh, value system that it's promoting. And I mean, I thought this from a young age, and then it was confirmed that I always thought of Star Trek as kind of secular humanist fables,
Hmm.
And then there was an interview that the next showed me that I think it was with DC Fontana, and she put it in exactly those terms, like that's what they were always meant to be. It's kind of secular humanist um,
Like
fables.
fairy tales, fables, stories about
Yeah,
morality and things. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, they're morality tales. Even I remember an interview with what was one of the producers of the Next Generation. He only did the Next Generation, although he was one of the co-creators of Deep Space Nine. I can't
Ronald D.
remember.
Moore,
No, no. Michael something or Michelle something.
Michael Chertoff.
Maybe it was him.
Yeah.
But anyway, he said that they were like, the morality tales, and he always thought that was the most interesting thing. to tell. But it still has a very broad appeal to people because it still has a sense of adventure, wonder. Like I think even for people who are not necessarily into the kind of secular humanist values, just there's something really strong about morality tales, and I think something that really appeals to a lot of people about dealing with those type of complex questions, and kind of seeing people who show strong character but are not perfect, that can still be fallible, dealing with those situations. And so, the characters are well written. It's always been that, but it's always had that kind of that swashbuckling action thing, even in the series that were more down key. And just I think it has there's a lot of things about it that has a really broad appeal, But the thing that you got me thinking about was, growing up as a kid and kind of young teenager, the environment I was in was very kind of conservative and religious. But I feel like Star Trek kind of almost corrupted me because,
Yeah, I know.
I mean, there are things I disagree with that kind of worldview in some ways, and with some of the things that Star Trek promotes, but or that I think can be problematized or put into question in some ways. But overall, my worldview is definitely much more Star Trek. Much more those types of values, that type of perspective on the world. And I think it was really more than anything kind of what informed my sense of ethics and morality in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. Um,
I really think that
so,
Star Trek taught me to like ask questions,
mhm.
to not just accept whatever I was being told. I don't think like corrupted me or destroyed my religion is exactly true, but it taught me to ask questions and look for the more logical solution. Um, and that every problem has a solution if you think about it enough, and that the more like radical, not radical, the more spiritual solution is oftentimes just like a lazy way out, a simple way that, yeah, you're just not thinking hard enough on the problem.
Yeah, I find myself as I have different experiences and stuff of what the there was a period where I was very anti-religious or even very anti-spiritual, and I find now that I'm not quite as hardcore rationalist or empiricist, but I definitely went through a phase like that, I'd say I'm still more that than anything else, and but I think the whole thing about questioning, always looking for the logical answer first. It kind of is like I guess some of the things that I've opened my mind to. It almost comes from the Shakespeare, or not the Shakespeare, the Sherlock Holmes quote that Spock loved, and that Data had just quoted in an episode I just saw that when you eliminate all the probabilities that what is it the most
All the
improbable.
things that are impossible, whatever is
Yeah.
left, however unlikely, must be the truth.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And also, like when I encounter things that kind of don't usually have a logical or an apparent logical or empiricist answer, I think I still go to Star Trek because I think, okay, well, to me, it doesn't seem like that. But maybe there's a lot more to the universe than we exist, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that a religious answer is necessarily the one. Like I think that like we kind of, especially with the internet nowadays, I think people kind of have overconfidence in our paradigms. Um, like people think of the world in more kind of abstract and simplified terms because they see it so much through the internet. But life is actually a lot more messy and complex in that way than kind of how we accustomed to think of in a lot of ways. But I think of it like this, if there's something I can't explain in a logical, scientific, or empirical way, I think, well, it's not necessarily a religious answer either, but it's probably something about reality or something about the way that the universe is that I just don't understand yet, and it might actually even break the paradigms of what we have, but it's still not like it's something that's so that's separate from our reality. It's just another aspect of it, you know. And in Star Trek, you see that a lot because it's interesting that I mean, you know, a lot of times we think of Star Trek as being very much kind of super rationalist things. But like I was talking to you before, and I said we should do an episode someday. Is there some things that are thrown in there, some kind of weird things too? But it was always kind of like, oh, it's an alien, or oh, it's something about about ourselves or about the universe that we just don't fully understand yet, but it's still part of our reality, you know. And so I think that it's kept me grounded in a lot of ways and things, especially living in Brazil because you encounter so many interesting just different ways of looking at things, and sometimes weird things happen. And I don't know. I think I both it gave me both an open mind to look at things, but also kept me grounded in the same way.
Yeah.
And also the
I
whole thing about compassion and understanding
Oh, for
before,
sure.
you
I
know.
think the like living in Brazil, uh, being a forever outsider now. I have moved through my progression of Star Treks, and the one that I really identify with now is Deep Space Nine
Mhm.
because that show is just full of outsiders. Um, like TOS, I never got into. I can appreciate episodes for what they are. And Next Generation was my childhood show, and I love Dad Picard dispensing his wisdom and telling everyone what's right and what's wrong, and that's wonderful. But Deep Space Nine is just a very adult show because there's not really a right and a wrong, and a lot of the times the bad guy is the guy who's right, and the Captain Cisco is like doing genocides
Yeah,
too.
I thought it was interesting. I hated that episode, but then they did like this do back episode after it. That I thought was
Yeah,
interesting. Like he ends up like getting conned by what's his name? I was confusing him with
Eddington.
Barclay, but totally
Eddington.
different. Yeah, Ellington. And and then his sister's like, oh shit, maybe I was wrong all this time, you know. But yeah, I mean, I have a somewhat of an attachment to the original series because even though it was at the time of the next generation, I didn't have cable, and what I was introduced to was the movies, and then later on, I discovered that they had the original series. It was on at like 5 or 6 in the morning, and as like an 11 or 12-year-old kid, I used to get up early, even before that, just to watch the episodes, and so I had somewhat of an attachment to the original series characters. But it was kind of weird for me to see the original series because they were so much younger, and I was used to seeing them in the movies, you know.
Right. Yeah.
But also, just the historic value, I mean, of Star Trek, the cultural impact that the original series had, you know, especially going back to watch the first season. I kind of been in awe when I watched the first season of the original series and think about how original it was and how original storytelling is and how much of the world today was actually shaped by that show, you know. I mean, I don't think there's really any other television show, or even any other, maybe others aside from rock and roll, that you could really think something in American pop culture or world pop. Well, I can't say about world pop culture, kind of American pop culture that has made such an impact on the world we live in today, and mostly for the good. I mean, mostly very positive one, you know. But there's so many people you look at NASA, whether they're engineers or astronauts, who say like that's where they got their inspiration. That's why they
Or
went
or look at, I mean, NASA is obvious, but if you look at like industrialists and CEOs and politicians, right? Like
in.
a vast majority of them, if you were like, where'd you get your inspiration? In their top five things, they're gonna say Star Trek. Like anyone from Barack Obama to Steve Jobs to uh, people, movers and shakers, important people in our world for the last 50 years were all influenced by Star Trek, in one way or another. And you can see it in like the design of our of our iPhones is just basically ripped from Star Trek.
Oh, it's an
Um,
iPad. I mean, they called them
yeah,
pads
Jesus
for,
Christ, guys! Somebody should be
yeah.
paying royalties to someone for that.
I'm surprised Paramount. Maybe they did. I never saw anything about it, but the Paramount never took them to task over that.
And to just to finish my Deep Space Nine thing, I thought it was very like fortuitous, very like in the moment sort of thing. That I come to Brazil and I start loving Deep Space Nine more because I really identify with the show, and then I get to see Renee here in Sao Paulo shortly before he passed away. And I was a little bit annoyed that the line that they had delayed, the organizers had really messed up and got everything delayed, because I just wanted like 2 seconds to tell Renee what he meant. That, like, I felt a lot like Odo. I felt a lot like the outsider as an immigrant, as an expatriate trying to live in a foreign country. I felt a lot like Odo, and I really wanted to tell Renee that his portrayal of Odo meant something to me now that in the past it never did. But they were like pushing that line, man. It was so fast that I didn't even get to say one line to him when we passed through. I was really sad about that.
Yeah. It's funny you say that because growing up, I mean, I got into start the movies, but then I was able to start to watch The Next Generation, and I remember watching the first episode of Deep Space Nine with my parents when it debuted. I think I was like 10 years. Oh yeah, I must have been 10 years old, but I can still remember that watching it with them the first time it came out. And I always related most to Odo in that show. That was because I grew up as very much of a kind of an outcast and a misfit. I was like the nerdy kid, and had this kind of romantic view of things. And then I was homeschooled too, which kind of left me out. Which I mean, even though I said my parents were conservative or religious at the time, that had more to do with kind of my mom's opinion of the Montana public school system than anything else. But it was also, I think it was good for me because I was just very different. And so I always felt kind of out of place, kind of like the misfit, like Odo. And then the whole unrequited love thing, because that was something that from the time I was, a preteen to a teenager, like, I had these really hard crushes, and they would never be reciprocated, and I would suffer so much over them. And then I grew up doing martial arts and stuff. So even though this is totally different from me now, like, but I always had this idea of kind of being a security guy and stuff like that. So like, Odo was my character from the beginning. And also I thought like that's so badass to be able to change your shape and like turn into any animal or get into anywhere. Like, I mean, how much? I don't think there's like anything that could be any alien that would be cooler than a shapeshifter. I always thought that was a really cool idea. So it was funny, that Renee was the one that came here when we went to there because, and like when you told me it was Renee, I was like, oh, you gotta go no matter what, because that was always my favorite character in that show. And I think growing up, that was the character, even of all the series, that was the character that I related to the most. Now when I'm older, I mean, not as much. I still love him, like that. Part of me those two, like, oh man, he's a cop. But but I mean, but he takes different because, and I think I like Odo because he is a kind of a complex character. Because sometimes he's an asshole, like, but he always tries to do the right thing,
Yeah,
even though he has very
his big thing
rigid,
is justice, right? And he
right.
has his own definition of justice. It's not whatever the government is trying to tell him. He knows what justice is, and he's going to do justice. And all right, that's Odo.
Yeah. And sometimes it turns him into a fascist, and sometimes it turns him into a total like
Hippie almost,
anti-authoritarian.
man.
Uh, so it's yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Like Deep Space Nine. I was kind of thinking about going through each series, but my wife Erica, who didn't grow up watching Star Trek, I was trying to get her into it, and she liked the original series, but we couldn't really watch it all the way through the first time. And then I was watching different episodes of different series, and she kind of came through when I was watching them, and she couldn't get into the Next Generation. Voyager, she was kind of like, oh, maybe it's good, but Deep Space Nine was the one that she really latched onto for some reason. And so we decided we were going to watch the entire series from first episode to last. And she just completely fell in love with Star Trek through Deep Space Nine. And and we just got done. We had gotten halfway through it, and we'd stopped for probably 2 years. Maybe not. Yeah, about 2 years. Watched Deep Space Nine, and then we went back to the original series and finished it. and now we're watching the next generation from the beginning. And it's been a while since I've watched a couple episodes here and there. It's been a while since I've watched Voyager. I never saw Enterprise all the way through, and I've been watching the new series since they've come out. But I still think that for me, definitely now, almost middle age and going back and looking at them and rewatching, that for me by far the Deep Space Nine is the best series.
Yeah.
And I think
Uh,
that's kind of almost a consensus nowadays too, with a lot of people in hindsight, you know. And it was very revolutionary in a lot of ways. But one thing I'll just comment before I'll pass it over to you is one thing I liked about it at the time. I mean, I liked it from the beginning, being a kid and stuff with it being a new series and everything. But I remember kind of thinking disappointed with some of the things when I was a teenager. Like I kind of felt like they had gone off from Roddenberry's vision in ways that weren't cool. And now going back and watching it, I feel like it never abandoned those core values, but it problematized and questioned them in ways that were very interesting and needed to be done. And that makes the show so much more that much more interesting and that much more timely and timeless. I think the fact that they did that because there are just a lot of things that were products of the time, right? The time that he included is also very progressive things, and just a lot of assumptions that when you get when you look at reality and kind of post-colonial world and stuff like that, which are kind of problematic. And Deep Space Nine really kind of dug into those things,
yeah.
and in a way that I think was really actually even ahead of its time for the '90s, And now you look at it and you're just like, wow, like I mean, questions about terrorism, about colonialism, about empire, about having ideals in a world that doesn't share those and stuff like that. And again, like of course, you're not going to agree with everything, with all the conclusions they come to, but overall, I think it's really the smartest show. Aside from how well developed the characters were, I think the characters are the most well developed, and it was just from somebody pointed out I saw that they started out just like totally seeming like the worst person for their job, and then you watch them grow over time, come into their own, and find that they were actually the perfect person for that hurt. Whether it was
the
because they
the
worked at the
only
beginning,
person that could do that job.
yeah,
They
basically,
they were just the perfect. They were the only person who could have done the job that they did.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah. No, I agree with everything you said. I think the other series, I think I watched by now between when it was on and now going back trying to watch. I think I've watched every episode of Voyager and it's not good. Uh, it just feels very uneven and it doesn't go anywhere. Like like how a sitcom kind of resets itself at the end of every episode and the characters don't go anywhere. That's how Voyager happens. And it's very disappointing because they have an interesting idea and then they don't do anything with it, which sucks. I tried to watch Enterprise, and Enterprise is at points interesting and at other points very bad, which is annoying also. I watched the first season of Discovery and gave up. I should watch it again. I've heard the second and third seasons are good, so maybe I'll try.
Yeah.
But the first three series, the original series, Next Generation, and Deep Space Nine, are really great because they have their own identity. Um, they didn't really try to just reboot. The first season of Next Generation is a lot like the original series, but then the rest of the show is its own thing. And the first part of Deep Space Nine is a lot like Next Generation, but then the rest of the show is its very own thing. And something that I've noticed a lot recently is that you can almost understand a lot of American history, a lot of American culture through Star Trek. Like how in the 19 late 80s and early 90s when Next Generation was going on, and Next Generation is this very uh, almost arrogant show. like it's very preachy and very this is the Federation telling everyone what's right, and everybody
Yeah.
else is just like, of course, it's the Federation. Gosh, we'll just do what they say, and it's of course it's the right thing. Who would ever question the mighty American Empire? I mean Federation, uh, and and that's the basis of the show. There's not even anyone around to ask questions about the Federation. It just does things. Um, and
They
then
started building the build up to Deep Space Nine, but I feel like it's only really because they were trying to introduce themes that would be in Deep Space Nine.
yeah,
You know?
and the like. I think this is so genius about Deep Space Nine, is that Deep Space Nine was at the late '90s, and yet they somehow predicted the war on terrorism, Iraq, America becoming a completely untrustworthy force in the world uh, situation. The show ended before 9/11, and yet they were there predicting it. I just,
Yeah.
it's
Well,
so genius.
there's even things like lines that are almost like word for things that officials in the Bush, the second Bush administration would say, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
And yeah, it was crazy. You know, I was watching the other day. I just got done watching actually, but Erica was watching. My wife was watching these videos by this Brazilian YouTube channel called Geeky Veio, which is old geek in Portuguese. And he talks about this idea of the timeline of Star Trek kind of being like the phases or the different stages of growth of humanity, but comparing it to like a human being from Roddenberry's perspective. And he only goes to the next generation because, you know, but he includes Enterprise, but he only goes to the next generation Enterprise in the because he feels kind of like Deep Space Nine and Voyager went off into another tangent. But I watched it and I thought, well, wait a second. Actually, I think you could definitely include Deep Space Nine in that because like his idea is that Enterprise is kind of like the adolescence of humanity. You know, when we're just starting to break out on our own, and we still have a lot to learn, but we've kind of made some. So we've learned some things about the world, and we're out exploring everything for the first time. And then the original series is like somebody in their 20s or early 20s, which now they're independent, they're on their own, they're a farly formed individual, but there's still some things left over from adolescence that are there. They're still getting to bar fights and stuff like that. And and then in fact he used the bar fight in Trouble Tribbles as an example. And then and then he said Star Trek was like the next generation was the mature person. But I thought about this and I thought, from my experience, you could definitely extend this to the Deep Space Nine because, like, for me, like maybe the original series would be like early 20s, and then next generation would be like when you think you know how the world works and you have these great ideals, and if everybody would just listen to you, you could solve all the problems. And then you get to like your kind of your 30s and you're approaching middle age, and you start to see that like your core values were still right, but things are actually a lot more complex about that, and you have a lot to learn, and there's a lot of other perspectives out there that you need to listen to, and things like who you thought were the good guys are not necessarily the good guys, and then who you think were the bad guys are probably still bad guys, and then who the real good guys are people you've never even heard of, and and so I think Deep Space Nine is almost like that. And then there was a lot of problems with the series, but I almost feel like in a way you could almost make an argument that like Picard is old age because it's like you're seeing everything fall into the cadence, like you feel lost in the world. And that's one thing I like about the series is that they definitely overdo it, but Picard finds himself out of his element a lot, which is something that never happened in the Next Generation. Picard is pretty much always, except for the one time he fell in love. He's pretty much like always like just like he found his way. And then the thing that makes Picard interesting, I know this was from what I've read and seen in interviews with Patrick Stewart. This was something he intentionally wanted for the series. Was is that he kind of does the Picard thing. It doesn't work, you know, and he's just kind of out of his element. And I imagine that that's what kind of what that stage in life is like for a lot of people. And I also like a lot of people don't like the idea of seeing their heroes as old, but I do because I know I'm going to get there someday, and I still want to be kicking ass in some way. And even though he's definitely out of his element, he's still Picard. Like he's still kind of he has something to contribute, um, and stuff like that. And I told Erica, that my wife, that that was the old man that I want to be someday. A little bit crotchety, a little bit, but still like very compassionate, very wise in a lot of ways. You know. But I
I
feel like you know, we can
I
swing
think
at it.
the solution to Picard is if they had started the show earlier. If they had started the show with Picard trying to rescue all the Romulans and doing the Picard thing as Admiral Picard or whatever he was at the time, and running into all this bureaucracy, corruption, and Federation terribleness and failing. And that had been the
Yeah,
beginning. The first season of the show had been that, without this crazy space battle for no particular reason happening.
yeah.
And then the second season could have been Picard trying to redeem himself, because then we might have actually cared that Picard needed to redeem himself. You know.
You know, in the data thing, it was good, but at the same time, it was kind of like forced because they were almost using that to understand why to make you understand why he had so many regrets and stuff. But the real question wasn't data; it was really this thing with the Romulans. And I was just thinking this before we started. Actually, for me, the best thing that came out of Picard, surprisingly, was the tie-in novel by Uma McCartney. I can't remember the title right now, but the author's name is Uma McCartney, and I listened to it on audiobook. And I was like, oh, I kind of need something that I can kind of listen to in the background and not care too much while I'm cooking and stuff like that. Because I was listening to a lot of heavy political stuff at the time, and I was getting kind of burnt out. Um, and it turned out to be really good, and it was that, you know, what you're talking about. And it was really well written, like that they understood the characters. You actually ended up caring about Raffi in the story and stuff like that, and she like you understood why Picard chose her and everything like that, and the relationship that happened, and what was going on with the Romulans, and how the Romulans are actually more complex than what they seemed, and then the whole like warrior nuns thing where they came out of, and why Picard had such a big connection to them, and everything, and what Geordie's role was in the thing, and everything. I mean, it's just really well written, and then also with like Maddox, and a lot of it is from his perspective too, and it kind of it makes you understand why he was so bitter. I mean, he's still an asshole, but you can kind of understand like why he had such a hard time dealing with him not being able to recreate data, which is what he wanted to do, you know, and why he did the things he did. And all things, it was just really well done. I mean, it was like what you said. It was what you know. I think maybe because of Patrick Stewart's age, that's the reason why they didn't do it. But you know, with Hollywood magic and everything, they could have.
No, I think they studios don't have faith in their public to do a like slow building character driven story. They wanted to get into the action immediately and have Romulan assassins firing guns on Earth in the first episode. Because that's exciting and that's what people want. But it's not that interesting, actually. What we want is to see Picard, like, totally fail and feel sad for him and want him to be able to recover and redeem himself. That's what we want.
Yeah. Well, I don't understand what made Star Trek great. I mean, I think that brings us to like where we were wanting to get in this podcast. You know, I'm glad that let's see here. Just as a note, to anybody who's interested, the novel I was talking about is called Star Trek Picard: The Last Best Hope.
The
I'm not
last
usually a,
best hope. Okay.
yeah, I'm usually not that big into tie-in novels, but this one is definitely worth your time. It was very well written. It's very true to the characters and to the Star Trek universe. And yeah, maybe the only Star Trek novel that I've read that I would highly recommend. But
Sure.
I think you know, like I remember seeing the poster for the first J.J. Abrams Star Trek movie,
Yeah.
and it was "This is not your fault, Star
Yeah.
Trek."
Great.
And
Let's wrap up by bashing on JJ Trek. That'll be great.
dude, we could do multiple episodes on that. But I even have a controversial opinion. I don't know if I want to whip out yet, but that we could talk about those movies. But you know, who they have doing the new series is one of the people who, you know, Kurtzman, right? That that did those movies with J.J. Abrams, and you know, I kind of I have a love hate relationship with Discovery. I liked Picard, but there definitely some things that they just was way off on the tone and stuff like that. But they try too hard to make it sexy, you know.
Yes.
Uh,
And
and that's
exciting.
not Star Trek, and
Sexy
that's not what
and exciting. Like
yeah,
like
and
even the old movies, right? If you go back to the original series movies, right? Like okay, the Wrath of Khan is supposedly the exciting one, right? But like 90% of that movie is not exciting.
yeah,
They they're like trapped on a planet and talking. And then like the exciting part is like 5 minutes of the movie, right? So you can't really make that comparison.
yeah. Well, what they did with a lot of that too is they drew a lot from classic literature, which is something that's
Yes.
always a part of Star Trek. It's kind of a little bit of Moby Dick with other elements, and you always have the Shakespearean thing, which is what made also like people were doubting it at the time, but what made Patrick Stewart such a perfect Star Trek captain because he was a Shakespearean actor,
Yeah.
and then there's so many original series episodes that were actually named from lines of Shakespeare from Shakespeare.
Yeah.
So that was always a huge influence on Star Trek. And
My
now it's a
my seventh
sex.
grade literature teacher, we read Moby Dick or part of it. I don't remember if he made us read the whole thing, and then we watched Wrath of Khan and had to write an essay about how the two are similar. That was my
Nice.
seventh grade literature class.
Man, so many people I know. It seems like the the teacher that made the biggest impact on them was the English teacher. You know, uh, like you, right? Who knows how many of your students are gonna like think 20 years from now? Ah, man, Ryan, he really fucked things up for me because I saw the world in a totally different way, and now, but a lot of that element is missing, and when they try to put it in there, it's kind of hackneyed or it's kind of like almost a fan service thing. But what I like that surprisingly, I really hated, and I think a lot of people felt this way, the idea that they felt that they had to tie Michael Burnham in Discovery with the original series somehow by making it retroactively this adopted daughter or adopted sister of Spock and everything. But something that surprised me about the second season is that I'm not big on these resurrecting old characters and having other actors, but I think what really made for me the only thing that's really worthwhile with Discovery is the second season, and they did something that I thought I would never see, but I always wanted to. And it's hard to explain why, but they brought Captain Pike back, and they did it in a way that was really spot on. It really worked. The actor that they got was perfect. The way they wrote him was perfect. I mean, he almost to the point where he almost is like one of my favorite captains. I mean, almost my favorite captain now. And I feel like they brought this. I usually am good at remembering names, but I think the pandemic brain is getting to me because I'm having such a hard time remembering now. But they brought on this writer halfway through the second series who could tell that she was a classic fan because they did some things that were nostalgia things, but I felt like it worked. Like the thing about nostalgia is if you do it just for the sake of nostalgia, it's crap. But if it's something that actually moves the story forward and makes sense for the themes, contemporary themes, and like that, I think it works. And they did that. And ever since I was a kid, I would never trade the original series crew that we got for anything. But I always wanted to see more of the Pike crew. The only explanation I can think of why is because I feel like the original pilot had all the elements that made Star Trek great, but it also had this kind of golden age sci-fi thing to it that I like, which is that sci-fi was still very kind of romantic and mysterious. Like the universe was still very mysterious, and that you have some of that in the original series, but not as much as that original pilot. And then the next generation. I mean, I love the series, but it's like going to a new planet is almost like walking down to the 7-Eleven. Like you don't have as much of a sense of adventure and mystery and kind of romanticism with space travel. that you did with the original series and especially the real pilot. So I think I was the only Star Trek fan on Earth that was actually excited when I found out Discovery was going to be placed before the original series. And then when they brought Pike back, that was just that, that, and then number one too, which is I think is a great character. Although they changed her in ways I'm not sure I like in Discovery, but and then it ended up working with having Spock in there because he brought certain things to it that I think were needed. And you even had this kind of critique of hierarchy that I liked, and some Taoist themes in there too. So I could tell this new writer that they brought in to do it halfway through the series, she was a classic Star Trek fan, and even a little bit of a fan of, or definitely a fan of Ursula K. Le Guin, that she put a little bit into there, which are things I love. So especially the second half of the second season is actually great. I mean, there's still a little bit too much of the pew pew lasers and but the mirror universe. What's her name?
Yeah,
Virgil.
the
Uh,
Empress from the Mirror Universe.
yeah,
Yeah,
with,
but I know what you mean about the pilot from TOS having a different feel than the rest of the show, and it being more like mysterious. And when you were talking, I thought that the rest of TOS would be more like fanciful. They
mhm.
they like almost treat the universe like a big joke, and they just go around poking it with a stick to see what happens.
Well, oh, I mean, Kirk quite literally is poking a lot of things with his stick,
Yeah,
and Spock's doing it in his way, which is mind melting with everything.
yeah, yeah,
So that's kind of what it is. And also talking about the human development thing, I think it works also when you talk about the characters because learning what I have about Gene Roddenberry, you see that like Kirk is very much that time in his life, like how he wanted to see himself. And he was very much, he was a total ladies' man. Like he was cheating on his girlfriends and wife all the time, getting as much as he could, and but he still, he was a pilot. He'd been in the Air Force and stuff like that. He was just kind of he wanted to see. I mean, he was just kind of an adventure. Had this very kind of progressive worldview at the time, and he put himself into Kevin Kirk. And then when you get to the next generation, you see like three stages of his life, I think, because you have Picard, which is the more mature kind of Renaissance man, who's still out there exploring and stuff like that, but is much more kind of reserved and mature and stuff like that. And then you have Riker, which you have James T. Kirk, and then you have William T. Riker, and Riker is like an anagram for Kirk. Um, and then Bill Shatner, William Shatner was the actor for Kirk. So for me, like Riker is Kirk in the Next Generation, and he was like the younger version of Roddenberry. And then you have Wesley, which he said from the beginning was him as a child. So you have all three of stages of Roddenberry. He's projecting that into the series. And I mean that's kind of a tangent, but that's something that's interesting about it. You have this theme of always of like kind of growth and progress and maturity. And as much as looking at it both from a personal perspective and as kind of humanity as a whole, which I think is one of the things that makes me love about it, but also one of the things that's kind of problematic and why Deep Space Nine is so good because it kind of pokes the holes in some of that idea of like progressive evolution of humanity. And then because you have like the Bajorans, which people kind of look at as like these backwards superstitious people, but then it turns out like that they're these like really kind of like they lived through an occupation and got their freedom, and in a lot of ways even though they are kind of backwards superstitious, they're also really wise and stuff. And like the Federation with their like confidence of them being this kind of advanced democracy, actually having some like, really dark underbelly in a lot of ways, and screwing things up more in some ways, and stuff like that. So like you still have the idea of like evolution and humanistic values and stuff like that, but also kind of like the other side of the coin, and then how that's problematic. And so I think everything goes back, like kind of like the station itself, back to Deep Space Nine when we talk about that. And it's kind of the middle of actually of the series too. When you look at them. Um, so you will probably see a lot of like Deep Space Nine standing in this podcast.
yeah,
Although
probably.
I plenty to talk about with the other series.
Deep Space Nine, Next Generation, a lot of that. But that's just to wrap up, Tom, um, what is your very favorite episode of Star Trek across all series?
I hate those types of questions because I'm not a favorite. I have a hard time with
All right.
so,
Maybe not favorite, but like if
yeah.
you had to go to a desert island, the desert island question, and you get to take an episode of Star Trek with you to watch for the next forever, which one would you want to take?
Man, it's always going to change. But I feel like this is almost too much of an obvious answer, but I hadn't actually seen it before recently. And to me, it encapsulated so much about what was best about Star Trek. And also because I always had this dream of being a science fiction writer. I like that part of it. But um, I think the DS9, Far Beyond the Stars,
Huh.
like which I when I was a kid I used to kind of hate those types of episodes where they like go back to the past and then it'd be like, is it really are they really in the future or is it all a dream? But it encapsulated so many of the things that are great about Star Trek, and also like questions that are so relevant to today too, and also just that I think one of the things I loved about it the most is I think it really captured what is great about science fiction in that episode.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's the episode that actually captures the essence of science, what makes science fiction great. And so that's the one I'd go with today.
Yeah. So mine's out of left field, but it's the one that I just keep watching repeatedly. It's a next generation episode that probably nobody else likes, uh, but it's Data's Day, and the reason that I like it is because it's so banal, and it's just a typical day for Data on the Enterprise. And yeah, stuff happens around him, right? Like the Romulan spy is there, and she escapes, and the Enterprise chases after her, and then they almost start a war, right? But it's not really important to Data, so you barely care about this story. What's important to Data is that Chief O'Brien and Keiko are getting married, and he's the best man, and so he has to learn how to dance. And so he gets lessons from the dancing doctor on how to dance. And he has to get Chief O'Brien and Keiko back together because they break up at the last minute. He has to convince them to go back together. And it's just a very, very normal day to day. And I must watch that episode once a month, at least.
Yeah,
I just enjoy hanging out with Data. So I'd watch that episode a lot if I had to for the rest of my life. Only one episode. Yeah, Data's Day.
that's great, man. I can't wait till we get there so I can watch it again. Because actually, I love epic storytelling. You can't see right now, but I'm even wearing a Star Wars T-shirt now. Heresy, talking about Star Trek. But I think my favorite stories are actually the day in the life kind of things. Like, I mean, when I was studying literature in college, I fell in love with Mrs. Dalloway. There's this sci-fi book I've read recently, which instantly became one of my favorites. I highly recommend it. It's called The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, and it's that type of thing. It's kind of a day in the life of the Starship Crew, and those type of stories, and that was one of the things I loved about the first season of Deep Space Nine too. It's very character driven, and it's not so much about going out into the deep and the adventures. It's more about people living the challenges of their everyday life. You know, and so that's a great choice.
Yeah, I
Definitely,
love it.
definitely.
I'll probably go watch it right now, actually. Uh, all right, cool. So thanks everybody for watching. We don't really have a schedule. We'll do episodes whenever we fucking feel like doing episodes. So screw you guys. Uh, and our very first like episode, we are probably gonna look at the difference between the TOS and the TNG. Look at the naked time, where they have like the same idea. Everybody in the Enterprise gets drunk, but it's a little bit different because it's TNG and TOS. And so whenever we get around to making that episode, you can look forward to that. And perhaps, if we're feeling bold, we can be drunk while we talk about the crew being drunk. Maybe.
Yeah,
We'll see.
we'll have to
We'll
find
see.
that. But
But until
yeah,
then, thanks, guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks, Tom. And see everybody later.
long and prosper.